Hello everybody and welcome back to my workshop. I thought I would share another recent acquisition. This is a Stanley Number 2 hand plane, and isn't she a beauty? I picked it up recently. I think I paid somewhere around market price for it, so it was not an inexpensive plane, but I thought it would be a nice addition to my shop. This one happens to be from the Sweetheart era, and it's just in beautiful shape, so I'm delighted to have it. And just for reference, here is the number 2, and there it is next to a number 3, and a number 4, and a number 5, just to give you an idea of the scale. Best way to describe this is it just looks like a shrunk down version of a number 4 hand plane. I'd like to make a couple more points that I think are noteworthy. And for illustration, I'm going to compare it to this number 3. Now, both of these planes are Sweetheart era. This one is actually a little bit older than number 3 here. You can tell by the lever cap it doesn't have the Stanley on it. And the logo at the top is the second Sweetheart logo, which predates the trademark that's on the number 2 iron. However, curiously, the number 3 has the frog adjustment screw down there, but the number 2 does not. The number 3 also has the large knob for the depth adjustment, where the number 2, it's kind of hard to tell. Maybe it's a large knob for a number 2, but it's not relatively a large knob. Finally, if the number 3, even though it's older, has this key slot running through the frog and the frog seat to help locate the frog, where this does not. My assumption is the type study, as is often said, are a set of guidelines, not necessarily rules, and they're based on the number 4. From what I understand, the further away you get from the number 4, the less accurate the type study is. So I believe the number 2 just didn't necessarily follow all the details of the type study. This is a Sweetheart era plane, and this is the last, meaning most recent versions of the Sweetheart logo. And this logo was used somewhere between 1923 and 1935. This particular iron has a fair amount of wear on it. A brand new iron would come up much higher from the lateral adjustment lever. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is a Type 13, which puts it in the neighborhood of 1925 to 1928. The lever cap has the keyhole slot, remnants of an orange paint behind the Stanley, and unfortunately there's a little chip taken out of that corner. And the lateral adjust lever has the word Stanley stamped into it. Generally looks in good shape, nice and straight. And the sole looks to be whole and intact, got its fair share of scratches on it, and this back area is still on it. I understand that on some of these planes this piece is chipped off. The back of the iron seems to have a Z stamped into it, and the front has the typical pitting and staining on the upper edge, but the lower area down here looks clean and in good shape. Chip breaker looks ordinary and in good shape. And here are the rest of the parts, to some degree disassembled. A little bit of the brass, the screws and whatnot got chowdered up a little bit. Did my best not to do that, but they're otherwise in good shape. Depth adjustment knob. This looks like it could use decent cleaning. The frog, curiously, seems to have really heavy machine marks or scratches going this way. I don't know if they're machine marks or what, but very heavy scratches running this way. And the side looks to be pretty mottled, not a very polished casting. Looks like a raw casting with a little bit of machining up here. No Japanning on this side, and similarly no Japanning on that side. And you can see the texture. Not very smooth, but the back, the Japanning looks in very good shape. The frog screws look a little chowdered up, but none the worse for the wear. The front knob nut and shaft look in good shape. The tote looks really good. A couple dents and dings, but no breaks, no significant chunks taken out of it. And the knob, I think there might be one hairline crack here. Or maybe it's there, maybe there's more than one. But otherwise in very good shape. And here's a look at the frog seat. It says number 2 here. A little bit of sawdust from work in years gone by. And again, this tab on the back is here. The Japanning looks in pretty good shape. By and large, it seems to be there. Instead of just grinding and filing the chowder marks off, first try to do is peen it back into shape a little bit, try to coax the metal back into its original shape before you start to remove metal. And that's looking a little better already. So I'm happy with that. It feels smooth, doesn't seem to have any big edges on it, and it looks as though the slot actually isn't in all that bad a shape anymore. Well, in here are all the parts and pieces. The metal has been cleaned in some hot soapy water, and the wood pieces I just kind of wiped them off a little bit. And I'm pretty pleased with the way it's all turned out. There's a beautiful patina. So I'm going to try to do my best to clean up the threads in very selective areas without removing any more patina than I have to. Starting to put an edge on this, I racked it up in the gauge, put it at 25 degrees, and I'm wearing a bar right in the center of the bevel. So this bevel was rounded or convex, which is generally not desirable. So, although it looks pretty close to 25 degrees, I'm going to have to dress the whole edge before I get to honing it. Well, for once I got lucky. This was pretty close to 25 degrees, so it only took me a couple minutes on the coarse stone to get the flat surface all the way up to the edge. There's a little bit down here by the heel that I didn't get, but that's not important. Well, I didn't show it on camera because you've seen me do it before, but once I established the primary bevel on the coarse diamond stone, this is around 400 grit. I just spent maybe 10-20 passes on the 700 grit diamond stone. Then I went to the 1000 grit water stone, the 6000 grit water stone, and then I stropped it on the nap side and the smooth side. Get out a scrap of paper, and we'll give it the old paper test. So that seems pretty sharp. So here are all the parts and pieces, cleaned and shined a little bit. I may have overshined the brass a little more than I wanted to, but it'll tarnish up pretty quickly. The rest of it looks great. It was largely done with just steel wool and a little bit of gentle wire brush cleaning. I went a little more aggressive on the threads with the wire brush on the bench grinder. And for the furniture, I just really wiped it down and steel wooled it very gently. I have this washer in the vise, and I file the inside a little bit. When assembling the plane, the nut sits below the level of the tote, and it's not quite at the same angle as the tote, but the tote's still loose, and I'm a little hesitant to try to cinch it down anymore. What I'm going to do instead is I have the two washers that I filed. I'm going to use those as a spacer and see if I can't get a tighter fit without having the nut go too deep. So I'll put one of the washers in, and that's holding it good and snug. And the leading edge of the nut is just barely proud of the front of the tote here, the hole in the tote. All the other threads and holes have received a little bit of oil. There's a fair amount of slop in how the frog sits in the body. In the center of the frog seat, there's three platforms, if you will. In the center one, looks like it wasn't milled very well. It looks like the end mill on the lower side, as you're looking at it, was a little bit deeper than the pass it made when it did the top. I can barely feel that with my nail. And I've also noticed the frog has a tendency to not want to sit in the center of the throat. It tends to want to sit a little bit off to the left. I have an extra iron from a block plane, and that is just about the correct width, so I can use that as a flat surface, a little sandpaper glued onto it. Hopefully I won't cut my fingers on the edge of the iron, and we'll see if this is going to work. Obviously I could use the iron of the plane itself, except I've already sharpened it and I don't want to cut myself. So I cleaned up the surfaces on the bottom of the frog and the frog seat. Well, here it is all assembled. Isn't she a beauty? I've reseated the frog, and the iron seems to be sitting well. It's a heavy cut. Cut it all. Well, we're getting some pretty fine little wispy shavings. A little wax on the bottom. pretty good. It's funny, I've used this guy a little bit and I find that I end up holding it like a block plane. I don't really put my fingers around the tote. I kind of hold it with my fingers extended on it. Much like a block plane, you'd kind of hold like that with your palm up against this area. And if you look at the size of the soles in comparison, this number 2 is pretty much the same dimensions as this Stanley 220. Of course, the big difference is this 220 is a low angle block plane, so the iron's at a very low angle, but it's a bevel up, so you end up with a cutting angle of about 37 degrees, where this guy, of course, traditional bench plane, has a cutting angle of 45. I'd just like to say, when I first got this guy, I took it for a test spin, and it worked really well. Then I took it apart and cleaned it, as I showed you, and when I put it back together the first time, I had a real tough time getting the iron to sit right to give me really good shavings. So I took it apart again, and I cleaned up the frog seat and the frog receiver. And when I reassembled it, it worked fine, but I don't want to imply that the work I did to the frog receiver or the frog fixed something. Perhaps it did, perhaps it didn't. It may have been that this originally had a really finicky frog and frog receiver, so you had to take a great amount of care to get it to sit right, and maybe I did something to make that a little better. Or it could be that when I assembled it the first time, I just goofed, or perhaps had a piece of schmutz between the frog and the frog receiver that I didn't notice. But regardless, it's working really well now. Well, that wraps up this guy. Hopefully I've covered everything you're interested in, especially if you're watching this. And isn't she a beauty, especially for being almost a century old? I'm looking forward to using it as appropriate in my workshop going forward. If you got any questions, leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Maybe share an experience of yours. Like, subscribe if you get the chance. It helps the algorithm and the metrics. And as always, stay tuned for the next one.